Hi everyone, this is Tracing History, an analysis of the United States population over time. What I'm going to be doing today is looking at the overall population of the United States over time and then narrowing down on some interesting patterns we're going to see. So let's go. First off, it seems obvious that the United States population is increasing. To see that, all anyone has to do is look at the years in the beginning of the United States and compare it to recent data from Gauthier et al. 2008, Gauthier et al. 2018, Gauthier et al. 2020, several papers from Gauthier et al. No date, and several articles done by the U.S. Census Bureau no date, to see this general trend of increasing. And it seems with a general trend of exponential growth. We're getting that J-bend on our graph here that looks like what exponential growth is characterized by. But let's look closer. What I've done here is taken the total population of each segment of 20 years and subtracted it from the next year segment of years to figure out just how much we're increasing in a 20-year period. At the very beginning, increase is obviously very small. America is taking its first steps. Just as we see in all exponential situations, at first the value starts small, but as time goes on, that increase grows. But there are three things that I find extremely interesting. Do you see them? Let's point them out here. The first is this sort of stabling out period here from 1880 to 1940. And secondly here in this 1960 to 2020 period. It seems relatively stable as far as population growth. There's some increase, but nothing too dramatic. Why is that? What is going on in these periods that population growth is not skyrocketing, but leveling out, being rather consistent, which is not something we often see as a nation is growing? But you may have noticed I said three things. The third is the startling increase here in this 20-year period between 1940 and 1960. So here's 1, 2, and 3. What is going on in each one of these situations? So what's happening? What is going on that we see our population growth is steadying so much in a 60-year period, increasing a dramatic amount, then steadying once more? Let's take this a portion of history at a time and figure out just what is happening. According to America's Best History No Date, what we see is a technology boom as we hit the 1880s. Yes, there is some that occurred in the last decade, in the 1870s, but really now we hit it. America Best History No Date shows us Edison's handiwork as well as Alexander Graham Bell's telephone being invented, which is only put into perspective once we realize that bridges and railroads are being constructed. With the creation of bridges and railroads comes the ability for mass travel across the United States, as America's Best History No Date explains, making manifest destiny a true possibility. The move out west can seem feasible, and with the telephone it is still possible for far more reliable and easy communication across the country. In 1880, we really see that population boom in comparison to the 1860s. According to America's Best History, as we hit the 1900s, we have a similar industry boom, the Industrial Revolution. Commerce becomes possible and flight revolutionizes transport. But we have to remember a world war looms on the horizon, which could explain why we don't see what happened from 1860 happening here in 1880 to 1900. But this exact factor of a world war does explain the slight increase from 1900 to 1920. But in the 1920s, we hit a brick wall. According to America's Best History No Date, once we hit the 1920s, we see the stock market crash, causing economic terror, the Great Depression, causing worldwide economic terror, and the world in terror. America's Best History No Date reports a second world war looms in the background. No wonder we see a dip in the population from 1920 to 1940. There's economic pressure and political pressure all around. The 1940s are characterized by World War II, according to America's Best History No Date, and as we come out of the war, we emerge as a superpower. And the Great Depression actually ends due to the outcome of the war and actions during the war. So what do we see? Before we continue to the massive spike in the population growth, let's hit the brakes and remember that what we found interesting in the beginning. This period seems to be categorized by a rather standard population growth. Why is that? Well, despite the benefits that should be coming from the industrial growth, this period ends with war and economic suffering. War results in loss of life, injury, and a focus on survival. And economic suffering increases the cost of life. Those who cannot survive with the cost of life could die. Those who cannot afford to have children most likely would not, resulting in that decline of population growth from 1920 to 1940. So we have that stabling out period here between 1880 and 1940. There really is something going on here, and that's war and economic suffering. Here we arrive at the baby boom. This is famous in history as it will eventually lead to urbanization and a substantial increase in population. If we remember our first graph, the population between 1940 and 1960 increases by just over 50 million people. But what's caused it? The baby boom is an event which occurs after World War II. But what has caused it? Why didn't this happen in comparison to World War I back here in the 1900s to 1920? Well, according to Britannica, no date, the increase was mainly due to a hold-off that happened because of World War II and the Great Depression. The last thing people wanted to do was have children in such a horrifying time, and some couldn't have children as their husbands were away at war. But upon return and with the ideas of freedom from economic pressure and the idea of peace, they were free to have kids, hence the baby boom. So really, because of this war period that happened in this 20-year span, when folks returned home, there was a stark increase in population because of that economic turmoil and war turmoil that had happened in this period of years. But now we also hit another stabling out period right here from 1960 to 2020. What is going on that we are stabling out again? What situation is going on in history? Well, now we hit the Cold War in the 1960s. And according to America's Best History No Date, hitting the 1960s, it was a time of cultural and civil reform. The civil rights movement was kicking off, but there was also cultural turmoil. America's Best History No Date tells us that in this period, we see civil unrest as America is divided by the Vietnam War. A president is shot, and another president is ousted from power. While the unrest may have progressed some cultural reforms through the civil rights movement, the 1960s were also largely constituted by a large amount of civil turmoil. What we also see, according to Planned Parenthood Action No Date, is the beginning of the abortion movement, which would also explain the general leveling out of population growth for the next 60 years. If more abortions increased, then it makes sense that we would have that stabling out. In the time of the 1960s and 1980s, we don't see a very large increase. It's relatively small right here. But that is understandable, as according to America's Best History No Date, things are just now beginning to come into order. The Cold War ends shortly after the end of the 80s, and technology is beginning to ramp up again. Looking familiar? It seems to be a similar point in time as the 1900s right here. Technology, innovation, and peace. Which also explains why we see a resulting rise in the population growth hitting 2000. But the 2000s are far from peaceful. This is the age when we launched the War on Terror, according to America's Best History No Date. After 9/11, with all the technology increases, so does security and a cracking down on issues like this, leading to further U.S. involvement internationally, compared to our pullout during the Vietnam War. So there is that stark increase, but that is due to mostly technology, it seems, because we hit the War on Terror due to 9/11 and then the following Iraq and Afghan War. And then, of course, there's 2020. This is really recent, so we have yet to see long-lasting effects from this year, but we can see a decrease in the population growth from 2000. And it's no wonder. America's Best History No Date points out that what we already know, the pandemic, COVID-19, which is causing the collapse of small businesses, and there is also a ton of political tension, leading to both economic, social, and political tensions across the country. But because of the already high population, the growth is still uniform when compared to others in this little branch of history. Had this not been the case, we could have indeed seen another Great Depression effect. Because our population was so high, our population growth wasn't going to be as small as it was, or decrease like it was going to, as it did in this area when we had the Great Depression and stock market crash. So in conclusion, what do we see? We see that in general, across history, there are things that increase population growth and decrease or stabilize population growth. So it's either going to increase, decrease, or stabilize. But they all seem to interact differently depending on the circumstances. For example, war decreased population growth. But once the war was over, right here, back in the 1960s, when we have our baby boom, we saw a major boom in the population. Peace seemed to allow for population growth, as we see in that baby boom situation right here, but also for the population to stable out. In this area right here, we have a section of peace, and right in this area here, we have a section of peace. It's in that stabling out movement. Turmoil, however, seemed to have a pretty consistent effect on the population. Great Depression, the population fell. 2020, the population growth fell. Seemed to have a pretty consistent stabling out point here as we hit the Vietnam War and cultural unrest. And cultural changes also seem to affect population growth. With an increase of abortions and Planned Parenthood came a steadying out of population growth. But with an increase of husbands and wives reunited came a sharp increase in population growth. All in all, any one of these factors here, any one of them, each individually affect the population, and it is clear that they have done so throughout the history of the United States. Technology, cultural changes, peace, war, poverty, famine, cultural changes, technology, and peace again. All of these affect the population, and it seems to always be in combination with one another that they cause, ultimately, that increase in population growth, but also those stabling out points.